Welcome to A Climate Change, a show where we talk with change makers and thought leaders who are taking action to stop the existential threat of climate change. I'm your host, Matt Matern. Today on the show, we have Shara Mohtadi. Shara is a former chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Energy. She has a long career in state and federal climate policy. And recently, she co-founded S2 Strategies, where she helps governments and philanthropies maximize the climate and economic benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. We talked about the role of state governments in advancing clean energy initiatives, the impact of federal policies like the IRA, and the need for community-driven solutions to climate challenges. Without further ado, welcome to the program, Shara Mohtadi. Welcome to the program, Shara.
Thanks, Matt. I'm delighted to be with you here.
Well, tell us a little bit about your journey. Let's kind of go back before you were fabulously successful professional and, maybe to childhood and say, hey, what kind of drew you in this direction to begin with?
That's a nice question to reflect on. I think growing up, I was a daughter of immigrants from the Middle East, and the real world impacts, the humanitarian crises in my childhood and my high school years led me to then read more and understand more about the impacts that climate change was starting to already have, especially in parts of Africa and the Middle East, and the relationship between climate change and migration and conflict. And I went off to undergrad and spent a lot of my free time doing research and going out into the field, kind of looking at the relationship between climate change and human impact. And ultimately led me into clean energy policy work, which I think is really one of the root solutions, we hope, to the climate crisis. So it's a very both fulfilling and meaningful place to work, but of course we're always, it always feels like those of us, including yourself, working on climate issues, it's kind of like this uphill climb that we hope that we can just make more progress till certain tipping points might be reached. So it's been quite the journey, and I'm glad to be on it with you and a lot of others here in the field.
Well, I think that is something that has heartened me through this process of interviewing lots of people over the last 3.5 years, is just how many amazing people are working on these problems and the incredible work that is being done literally around the world to help solve the climate crisis. You raised one thing that I think I don't read that much about, and I think needs to be talked about more, which is migration and conflict related to climate change and the potential disaster scenarios that we're going to have to face if we don't solve the climate problems, the massive migrations, talking about not millions of people, but tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, having to move because potentially where they live right now might become uninhabitable, like in the Sahel region in Africa. If there are major droughts, which are being predicted will occur because of climate change, you're talking hundreds of millions of people having to move out of that area. So I feel like that those costs are not being accounted for by average citizens of like, this is what climate change looks like. It's not just a modest increase in rainfall or a few more wildfires to deal with. It could be really cataclysmic.
That's right. I mean, I think we are already, if you look over the past, let's say 30 years, let's take maybe drought as an example. You raised the Sahel region in Northern Africa, also parts of what used to be known as the Fertile Crescent historically of the Middle East, really agricultural hubs that over the past 20, 30 years, the data has shown that climate change has made the severe droughts that these areas have started to experience much more likely than if climate change had not been a variable, which is currently on the table. And so there are examples, and the research that I worked on and we published when I was a student at Columbia looked specifically at the example of migration in Syria prior to, now it feels like a long time ago, but right around the time of the Arab Spring, when you had a very severe drought that lasted 3-4 years in Syria, and families had made the decision to permanently migrate from many of these, what used to be breadbasket regions, to cities within Syria. And that we were able to show was one of the pressure points leading to some of the initial uprising and unrest that started the Arab Spring protests in that country, which, a lot has changed and not changed since then, with Bashar al-Assad still in power. But that's right. I mean, in a way, whether it's the movement of millions of people, or it doesn't, I think, even necessarily have to be tens of millions, but even families en masse deciding that the life that they currently live where they are is no longer tenable. Those kind of, that can be, destabilizing, not only about uprooting their communities and their history and culture and where they may have come from, but also to the receiving and host communities on the other end. And we're seeing more examples of that. And as you said, Matt, we'll see even more, I think, in the future.
Well, tell us a bit more about S2 Strategies, why you founded it, and what is exactly the type of work that you've been doing and plan to do in the future.
Yes. So at S2 Strategies, my co-founder, Sam Ricketts, and I are both former state government employees and policy advisors. And when these legislative bills were passed, including the Inflation Reduction Act, which all of a sudden opened up a whole new slate of clean energy investments in the US, one thing we realized was that state governments had pretty large differences in the resources they had to actually access these resources or access these clean energy incentives. What I mean by that is that, for every, let's call it 500 people in New York State that work on clean energy within the state government, many other states only have 1, 2, maybe 3 people focused, and they're all trying to access the same resources, whether it's educating the residents that live in their state, whether it's, accessing all the grant dollars that were for the first time available to these states. So it began as thinking about how do we kind of help provide technical assistance and support to states of all political stripes, of all sizes, to help them have the most ambitious and successful clean energy agenda they could have. And we've expanded from there, and we now help NGOs, companies, cities, and tribes as well in kind of building and implementing their own clean energy agenda and future.
Well, I've read a little bit about the rollout of the IRA, and one particular example was Governor Tim Walz in Minnesota has, I guess, accessed a lot of those funds effectively. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with what he's done and maybe how he's done it. And is that a role model for other states?
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm from Minnesota and a proud Minnesotan, so I could certainly speak about, I have some familiarity with Governor Walz's leadership. I would say Minnesota has certainly been one of the nation's leaders in understanding how they could take all these new federal incentives unlocked, as you said, Matt, by the IRA, and make them go as far as possible for every Minnesotan resident. So, for example, just a year or two ago, Minnesota passed its own really historic legislation with leadership by the governor and with the state legislature to set much more ambitious climate goals themselves and put state dollars to match federal dollars to really create the most comprehensive package of solutions for residents. Just to give you an example, Minnesota set up a new green bank, and what they're able to do is provide really affordable, subsidized loans to communities, especially to cities and nonprofits across the state who are looking to build, solar panels or solar and storage on their properties. They just funded a affordable housing unit in Minnesota that's going to build geothermal to be heated and cooled by a geothermal solution. And that's all thanks to the leadership of the governor and his team. And we really think it's Minnesota has been one of the leaders for the climate agenda of really most states we've seen.
Well, I was questioning whether you're really from Minnesota because I didn't hear a you betcha or anything.
I know, it's kind of diluted now over the years. I left when I was 18, but once I land at Minneapolis airport, I see that Caribou coffee, it starts coming back.
Okay. Well, yeah, I heard a little Minnesotan, it's the tiniest little touch there, but it's all good. Yeah, I'm a kind of a neighbor state and coming from Illinois originally.
Fantastic.
I think I may still have a little bit my Chicago accent.
It's coming out of it.
A little bit, yeah. So who are you working with currently? Can you say what are the types of projects that you're working on? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the victories you've had in working with them to get IRA monies into the hands of worthy projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So at S2 Strategies, we run an initiative called the State Support Center, which is philanthropically funded. And so we're able to, that's our nonprofit work. So we are able to provide pro bono support to state governments in particular to help them with their clean energy policy agendas. I can give you an example of one really cool thing we're working on right now. States play a really important role in educating their residents about how they can take advantage of all these clean energy incentives that are available. Often the federal government has a harder time communicating to their residents in their states. And so we're working with a number of states, again, of different political stripes and across the country to set up roundtables, specifically trying to bring together churches, school districts, and other large nonprofit landowners in certain regions of these states, because there's a new tax incentive in which I'm going to get a little wonky, but this might be of interest to folks who work in the space. There's a new tax characteristic called elective pay, which means that if you previously worked in an organization like a city, a church, a school that never had to pay taxes, you could never take advantage of any of these tax breaks that a lot of companies get to when a company puts up solar panels or installs geothermal units. And so for the first time, elective pay has the IRS paying you cash back on to any of these non-taxable project owners. And so that's the wonky part of it. But what's really cool is we're going to see more, again, churches, schools, city governments, city buildings, again, folks who've never had to deal with the IRS, the tax system, get up to from anywhere from 30% up to 70% off any sort of or many sorts of clean energy projects that they choose to build. So we're helping through the state governments develop these kind of roundtables and outreach and education to these sorts of organizations across their states where they're interested. And that's really an example of the power of the state in partnership with NGOs and other advocates on the ground.
Well, that's great. I mean, obviously, all those different organizations like schools and churches have rooftops and could access using solar and things like that, and reduce their energy footprint by installing it and giving them the incentive to do so. Benefits all of us to have more power capacity, particularly now that we've got AI coming online that's going to be taking even more power. It just seems like that is a little bit of a Sisyphusan journey. Is that once we seem to install a lot of solar and wind, then they figure out a way to use even more power than we're currently generating. So
That's true.
I guess that goes back to your experience in the federal government working in this Department of Energy Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Um, Certainly, there's a lot of gains that we can make in terms of energy efficiency. Is that anything that you're working on at S2 Strategies?
Certainly. I mean, you know, when I was in the Department of Energy, one of the main focus areas is as responsibly as possible using taxpayer dollars to make government investments in those innovations that the private market just wouldn't have a risk appetite for. And what's really exciting, what we're seeing now is thanks to this larger injection of taxpayer dollars through, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act or IRA, we are seeing the cost curve come down more quickly in the marketplace. Companies being more interested in kind of doing the handoff from government subsidized innovations to the private marketplace. I'll just give you an example. The Department of Energy, and this is also a place that we are somewhat involved. The Department of Energy had a $8 billion hydrogen hub program through one of the recent infrastructure laws. And the idea is that you have a hub, an area where clean energy producers and customers, such as, let's say, hydrogen powered trucks and maybe Amazon trucks might be powered by hydrogen one day, could use this hydrogen system and fuel input in this hub center. And the government is putting up half the cost for that, and the private sector is putting up the other half. In some cases, states are also partnering with the private sector to make up that other half. We hope that will kind of cross this innovation cliff that sometimes happens. And in the next 10, 15 years, we'll see hydrogen uptake, both the distribution of it and the use of it, be a lot more common and be in the way that we see, gasoline. And now we're starting to see more electric vehicle chargers across the country.
Well, I'm a big fan of that, as I've had now 2 hydrogen cars over the last 6 years. So,
oh, amazing.
California is, I think, the only state that really has the infrastructure for the hydrogen cars. And it started back with Governor Schwarzenegger, and he had a very innovative head of the California EPA, and they were visionaries starting that to build out those stations. And Toyota and Honda, and I believe a couple of other manufacturers manufacture cars that are using hydrogen. And quite frankly, we've spent so much money building infrastructure for the oil and gas industry that is much dirtier. Why don't we spend the money on a hydrogen economy, which the emissions from my car are H2O? So that's a heck of a lot cleaner than the burning with an internal combustion engine. So
that's right. We just have to make sure that hydrogen is produced using renewables, and then we can have it be as clean as possible. We are seeing some cases where hydrogen is being produced. We call it sometimes gray hydrogen, where it might be produced using gas or even, God forbid, coal. But we are, the government has set certain rules around ensuring that as much of the hydrogen they're helping fund is renewable powered.
I know that one of the goals of the Biden administration early on was to bring the cost of hydrogen down to like $1 a kilogram. Do you know where we're at in terms of that process? Are we anywhere close to that, or are we miles away?
That's a good question. I have not checked in on the latest numbers, but that's a good question. I mean, definitely the Department of Energy keeps an eye very regularly on those goals. So we should check in with those colleagues and see how it's going.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's price is the big thing, is that if we make it price cost competitive, then manufacturers and consumers will move in that direction, and probably the government needs to give a little bit of a push to go in that direction. But it's also we also have to look at it as from a national security standpoint, in that having cleaner energy and not being dependent upon fossil fuels makes us less subject to the whims of governments that are not too friendly to us, such as Russia and Iran and others that are big player, Venezuela, who are big players in the energy business, aren't fans of the U.S. and aren't fans of our allies either. So that is, to me, that's one of the biggest kind of utilitarian ways to look at the energy world, is that getting off of fossil fuels puts us in a much better national security position, as well as all of our allies that are relying upon it, like Japan and Germany and the rest of Europe. So like we should be looking at those costs as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is exactly right. I mean, I think that historically, I think the energy security reasons for investing more in clean energy are critical. And I hope that no matter who's elected in November, and I know we'll get to that, but no matter who's elected in November, that really becomes one of the top kind of forces, in addition to all the humanitarian reasons, just the quality of life that we all want to have in mitigating climate change. But energy security is very much a top reason. And that should be even more of a bipartisan issue and reason than it is. And, I'd be happy to talk about the risks of a Trump administration in reaching some of these energy security goals. Yes.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about first your work with red states and the S2 strategies and building out or helping states that have been historically red states to access these IRA funds and to generate green businesses in their states.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's been amazing to see that. Every month or so, there's kind of a tally up that some of the NGOs do of which states have been able to access the most IRA or other federal clean energy incentives than others. And it's very much, red states are at the top of the list. States like Georgia, for example, are really showing a lot of leadership in how you can take clean energy as an economy builder, and the amount of foreign companies committing, and not only now committing, but 2 years after the Inflation Reduction Act, building factories in places like Georgia is really outstanding to see. So, in addition, I would say there's programs like there was a grant program called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, and you had almost every single state, again, no matter their politics, applying to that program. And all what they had to do was show how they plan to reduce emissions overall. And those funds could be used to reduce those emissions based on the strategies they put forth. That program was completely oversubscribed. They got over 330 state and local government grant applications. Again, almost 50 states did submit. They were 6 to 10 times oversubscribed. So really phenomenal to see, deep bipartisan interest from states, because they know it's they know for economic reasons, for their own economic development and own interests, it's smart to bet on clean energy and bring those investments into your own state.
Yeah, I saw recently that there were 18 Republican congressmen who were saying they would not vote to repeal the IRA. So that was a hopeful sign that, even though there have been a lot of rumblings from Trump and others that they would work to repeal the IRA, if 18 Republican congressmen weren't willing to vote for it, then even if they had control of both the House and the Senate and the presidency, that it wouldn't be repealed.
That's right. Yeah, I think that if there's a scenario, as you said, in which, President Trump is reelected and you have Republican control of both the House and Senate, I think we'd see, my hope is we would see even more than 18 congressmen, be approached by their own governors and their own state representatives and the companies that have now made investments in these very states, to not repeal the Inflation Reduction Act or other clean energy incentives. At the same time, there are some.
Would that?
Yeah, please.
Would that affect the cash flow stream that these companies have expected based upon their investments? So it's not just a one-time cash or tax credit that the IRA offers, but it's a stream of income that occurs over a period of years for any company that is kind of making a major investment under the IRA.
That's right, exactly. A number of the tax incentives are, for example, the production tax incentive is one that is based on how much energy you're producing, and that is more on a year-by-year basis. Even some of these, what we call grant programs, which means kind of large injections of funding by taxpayers to help offset the capital costs of a project like a hydrogen hub. Those are not just, one-time payments and one and done, but those are released, to make sure that the project's being responsibly built. Those are released by the government over years. And so there are definitely actions that we've heard from the Trump campaign and Trump himself that they would want to be taking unilaterally, even without Congress, to try to slow down those dollars, to maybe put some of those programs into question. There's a lot of damage that could be done, even without a Republican-led or let's say a Congress that wants to repeal the IRA, to slow things down and to cause a lot of uncertainty that we could see a lot of these investments leaving our shores.
Well, I guess that segues into the next question, which is, as we approach the 2024 election, what do you see as the most significant differences between Trump and Kamala Harris, and as far as climate policy, and how that will impact the country going forward?
I think that the differences in this election cycle could not be more stark. On the one hand, you have Kamala Harris, who cast a tie-breaking vote to pass the Inflation Reduction Act in the first place. And then you have former President Trump, who has vowed to dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act, has talked publicly about how he plans to do that, how much he could actually accomplish unilaterally, still up for debate, but a lot would be at risk. And I think Trump has made it very clear that even if the market would dictate it, it's almost as if he feels like a personal vendetta against climate forward policies that are also good for the economy and good for keeping jobs that have only recently started to come being built in places across the country to keeping those here in this.
He certainly made a number of comments about being against electric cars over the years, which now is a big part of all of our major car companies here in the U.S. are making electric cars.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, but it's kind of up to his whims in a way, because now, of course, Elon Musk as an advisor is maybe having him call into question his thoughts even about that. But yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's really not. I think what's concerning, and we've even heard there are concerns from oil executives about the uncertainty around certain tariffs that he might place on crude oil that they import to then refine. And it's like it's the uncertainty, unpredictability, and chaos, and the lack of using, even if you use market-based principles and logic and rationale, that I think is really concerning to many of us, including, again, executives in these major companies who are having to make business decisions.
Well, it's very striking when the major oil companies are admitting that they have an impact on climate change, yet Donald Trump is denying that any of them do. So it's just flying in the face of reality. Do you think that the chairman of Exxon and Shell and all these other majors would admit that there was climate change if they didn't have to, if it wasn't, extremely obvious that it was occurring? And of course, we've come to learn over the last number of years that Exxon and their compatriots knew of this back going into the 70s and 80s, that the emissions and the CO2 levels were going to rise and that were going to cause extraordinary problems, and they went ahead with it regardless. So
it's a great point, Matt, and I think I do think that Trump has, as opposed to maybe where Republican politics was even 10, 15, 20 years ago, heck, even 30, 40, I mean, where it's always been, it feels like the far, far swing to the right of where we are now, hearing from the Republican Party about clean energy and the climate crisis and the kind of attacking of it, it's causing, the Exxons and other majors, as you said, to be able to have decades longer of this, playing around with renewable solutions, but really being, but on the other hand, funding pro-oil advocates and anti-climate lobbyists for longer than they should, because it means that the country remains on these kind of polar sides of things, artificially polar, instead of us all moving in the natural direction of seeing the crises unfold, environmental crises unfold in our own backyards. So it's really unfortunate. I mean, I hope, of course, that Trump is not reelected, and that politics in general in this country can go back to being a little bit more reasonable and based on rationale and logic.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago when Republicans unanimously backed clean air and clean water in the 70s, and George H.W.
Exactly.
Bush backed clean air too in the late 80s, early 90s, and protecting the environment was more bipartisan. I don't think they were doing a perfect or great job at it, but they were making some strides. There was some degree of recognition of this was a problem. And quite frankly, the oil companies probably had bought and sold both political parties in, burying their heads in the sand for the last 50 years in many ways. So I would say it's up to us as voters and consumers to say, hey, enough is enough. We are no longer going to listen to the oil companies and what they want, because they don't have our best interest at heart. They have the interest of making the most money with the asset that they have, which is oil. And if it hurts us, they're kind of willing to risk the planet for their current profits, which is detestable, but it is what they're doing.
Totally. And I think, ultimately, if you were to ask me what can folks listening at home do to positively impact the environment, it's what you said, Matt. It's vote. It's go vote. Go to the polls. Get involved in campaign work if that's what's interesting, or talk to friends that live in swing states about if how they're planning to vote, or if they'd like to talk about where they are on their issues. But voting could not be more powerful for the environment than it is in the next 40 something days we have left.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that it's getting that close, and yet more can be done and needs to be done to elect officials that are going to protect the environment and really care about it, because it is the most important issue facing the planet. If we don't have a planet B, as they say.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about your next strategies for S2 and what projects or initiatives you're particularly excited about going forward.
Yeah, well, we have, we are thinking a lot about, election kind of planning, if you will. How can state governments, if need be, try to have backstop solutions ready, or make up for the leadership vacuum on climate if Trump is elected? Part of it is that they can do what they can, but it pales in comparison to what the federal government can do. So let's not kind of rest on that necessarily in peace, but we are thinking about what that looks like for state leadership, taking advantage of state leadership, bipartisan state leadership that, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, has now been built up if Trump were elected. And we are, on the flip side, much more excitedly and hopefully looking at if Vice President Harris, it's a bit premature for President Harris yet, but if she were elected, the next slate of climate legislation, and we're working with a number of NGOs in Washington and across the country, thinking about and putting forward policy proposals. Just as an example, one of the areas that the Inflation Reduction Act did not cover as well as it could have was industrial emissions. So, we have a lot of cement manufacturing and steel manufacturing in this country that are really important industries to much of the heartland. And there are ways to make those processes more energy efficient. There's
hydrogen.
New fuels, right? Green hydrogen certainly could be one, but it's really costly, especially these are, small margin, mom and pop, often run factories in rural America that need more government support to become more efficient or have inputs like hydrogen. So that transition is one that we hope, just as an example, future legislation could address. And we had a lot of hope for what the future brings.
So it's been great having you on the show. I appreciate your time and the great work that you're doing out there in the world, and keep it up. And we'll have to stay in touch to see how this progresses going forward.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for everything you're doing with the podcast and the diversity of guests and perspectives you bring. And it's been a lot of fun this past hour. Thank you.
And that was Shara Mohtadi. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you want to learn more about her work and S2 strategies, visit S2strategies.org. To learn more about our work at A Climate Change, and how you can help us reach our goal of planting 30,000 trees in the Amazon this year, visit aclimatechange.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. See you next time.